so excited that you all had me put your faith in me tonight. And I wanted to also give a little shout out to Marie Luna, who's the first person I met. Hi, Marie, at your congregation. And I'm so happy that I get to be back in Appleton. You know, this is how I'm dealing with COVID. I can't go anywhere. I'm still in my house. But tonight I'm in Wisconsin with you, even though I'm actually in Massachusetts. I'm on Cape Cod right now, which is a very nice place to be. But I would much rather be with you in person. And so tonight, we're going to talk a bit about this generation that I call the Stonewall Generation. Somebody's not muted.
Okay, we have to make sure everybody's. Please mute yourself. Thank you.
So in addition to what Colleen said, I'm also a researcher. And now that I've had my first book published, I can call myself a writer, even though I've been writing for years. And this book that Colleen just mentioned, I put it in the chat in case you're interested. It's at the UUA and Spirit bookstore, but it's also in local bookstores. And I just finished writing it. It took about 4 years. And I was fortunate enough to have Skinner House Press publish it. And they're a great publishing company. And I have to say, it was a really fun book to write. I crisscrossed the country interviewing LGBTQ elders from different racial and ethnic minorities, people of different sexual orientations, people of different gender identities, and people with different political work. And it was really fun interviewing them. I think the hardest part of the book was actually after I did the interviews, then I had to actually write it up. But the interviews were amazing. And I got an opportunity to elevate the voices of people whom you never hear from. And I asked them about Stonewall, which we'll talk about in a moment. I asked them about their sexual lives, because I'm a sex researcher and I'm interested. And I asked them also about their social justice work, because that's really, to me, I've been an activist for so long. I wanted to find out what Stonewall did in terms of bringing them forward in their own social justice work. And I also asked them about what it means to be an elder or to be an older person. So I've been doing a lot with the book this summer and fall. In fact, I just got an article accepted into the Journal of Black Sexuality and Relationships on Black LGBTQ elders talking about sex. And 3 of the women in the book wrote that article with me. So that was cool. I got to kind of do another project with them. And since this is October, and October is LGBTQ History Month, I thought this is my opportunity to really, again, lift up these voices. So my question for you is, and I'm going to start by sharing my screen so you can see my slideshow here. Let's see, Marilyn, tell me if you can see that. Does that look okay, Marilyn?
Yes.
Yeah, great. I'm looking for your thumb at all times, going up, not down. Good, okay, thank you, Marilyn. So why is it important to understand the history of LGBTQ elders? And this group that I call the Stonewall Generation, for them, coming out took great courage. It may be different today, but in the 60s, it was a turbulent time. And some of you who are rocking out to our playlist may remember the 60s. It was also an exciting time with a lot going on, but it was also a time of great fear. It was a time of secrecy, a time where intimate lives are hidden from the shadows. And yet in the midst of it all, in the midst of all of that, the Stonewall Generation has continued to fight for freedom, for rights, for love, and yes, for sex. So what's important about tonight's conversation, and I'm going to introduce you to some of the people that I interviewed who contributed their amazing life stories to the book. What's important about it is not just about this book, but it's about your practice with including LGBTQ elders in your congregation here in Appleton. And I'm wondering, you know, I'm going to ask you some questions at the end that we can talk about in some smaller groups, but think about these questions. I want you to use two parts of your brain tonight. Be listening with what's going on, but also be thinking about how you relate to LGBTQ elders. And do you identify or know anyone who's an LGBTQ elder? And if so, what are your stories or what are their stories? And do you have any ideas about how to make your UUA congregation more welcoming and inclusive for the leadership and the involvement of LGBTQ elders? And most importantly, the last question is, what role can you play in making these changes? So here's what we're going to do tonight. I'm going to introduce you to some of the people, as I said, and you're going to hear their words directly. And then we'll have some time to talk about these in a couple of breakout groups. Probably, I don't know, Mary Ellen, you're in charge of that part. But we'll get to hear from each other a little bit more. So the first thing I have to ask you is I need 5 volunteers. Now, when a sex educator asks for volunteers, sometimes people get nervous, but the volunteers are only going to read a quote, an excerpt on the screen that's about maybe a paragraph. So if you're able and interested in reading a paragraph off the screen, can you identify yourself by just raising your hand? And Marilyn and Colleen, can you help me? Because I can't see everybody at once. So I just need 5 people raising hand. Okay, Suzanne, is that you? Are you Suzanne? All right, yay. Suzanne, you are number 1. Okay. I need 4 more people to be brave. Molly, you are number 2. I got you. Who else?
Marie.
Marie, thank you. You're number 3. We need just 2 more people.
Margaret.
Margaret, thank you. And Colleen, would you like to be number 5?
Sure.
Well, thank you for volunteering. Thank you for letting me volunteer you. Okay, so I just want to tell you a little bit about how I came to this project, because as Colleen said, I got my PhD in human sexuality, and I just got it like 4 years ago. I just graduated. In fact, I tried to get my kids to call me Dr. Mom, and they wouldn't have anything with that. But I graduated in 2016 from Widener University at the age of 62. And I have to say, if you want to try something hard, go back to school in your late 50s. It's not easy, but it's really fun when you finish. And for my dissertation, I did quantitative research. And by that, I mean, I did statistical research, which was great because I got it done. And I got some really interesting results, which I'd be happy to share with you later. But, you know, after I finished, I was really looking forward to the stories. I got some comments from people, but I didn't really get to hear all the stories. So from almost the moment I finished school, I started working on this project, and I knew that I wanted to interview LGBTQ elders, and I wanted to look at their lives in a more deeper and maybe more insightful way than I could with the numbers. My research was on LGBTQ elders and their sexual satisfaction. And again, I'd be happy to talk about that later. But the way I found these people was I started out the way I always do. I put on my community organizing hat, and I handed out postcards on the street, on Commercial Street, and I went to women's, I had friends who were going to the Women's Music Festival, the last one in Michigan, and I went to all the gay choruses, and I went to softball leagues, and I went to SAGE. And if you're not familiar with SAGE, SAGE is a great group, a really good reference for anyone who's interested in this population. SAGE stands for the Advocacy and Services for LGBT Elders. And I was looking for people whose lives were changed by the Stonewall Rebellion. And at first I thought I'd find people who were there, because there were lots of people in the bar that night, and it wasn't that long ago. It was less than 50 years ago when I started this. But I realized that what I found was that there were people out there who were not near, they were hundreds of miles away from Stonewall. They weren't even in New York City, but their lives were completely and indelibly changed. So I found 10 great people, and I think of them as elders, as the Stonewall generation. So that's kind of how I got started. So let me tell you a little bit about where I went from there. So this amazing young person is me when I was about 20. I was in college. I was coming out. It was the early 70s, just a few years after the Stonewall Rebellion. And I was experiencing the world as what I called myself then, a baby dyke. And I was sometimes kind of afraid and sometimes nervous, but I felt so alive for the first time in my life. And little did I know then that today I'd be chronicling the lives of people who were hidden to me at that time. And if you look on your screen really carefully, you see the sign here. It says Stonewall Inn, and that still exists. It's right there on the corner of Christopher Street in the West Village, which was a pretty gay neighborhood back then, as it still is now. And that black and white photo is exactly the spot where the uprising took place. And it was a galvanizing moment. People call it the birth of the modern, quote unquote, gay rights movement, or the beginning of the what we now call the LGBTQ community. But it wasn't the first time this community had risen up. And we can talk about that later if you're interested, but it certainly wasn't the last time. And when people call it the birth of the modern movement, what I realized is that in my book, the people who were there the night of the rebellion, they tell their stories alongside everyone else who wasn't there but felt the reverberations wherever they were living. And here's this beautiful, I think, exquisite cover. You see, it's the same photo, right? But it was drawn by a great artist at Skinner House Press, who basically allowed me to have this black and white cover in color in a rainbow right on the cover of my book. So I was pretty excited about that. And I'd like to start by introducing you to some of the photos that were taken when I did the interviews. And when I went around the country, I was accompanied by a wonderful photographer in each city. This photo was taken by Louis Shackleton. Shana Surik, who's an old friend and a wonderful photojournalist, Bill Bamberger and Bruce Antink all took the photos. And this first photo I'm showing you is a pretty amazing woman, Miss Major Griffin Gracie, and she lives in Little Rock, Arkansas. She's a trans woman of color. She's a Stonewall veteran. She was there that night. She's a former sex worker, a community leader, and a prison activist focused on the disproportionate incarceration of transgender people, particularly transgender women of color. She's a visionary for transgender political action. And there's Dave Velasco Bermudez on your left, with his husband, Bob Isidore, with his arm around him on your right. And they're at their home on the Cape, on Cape Cod. Dave is a Puerto Rican gay man from the Bronx. And he also is a Stonewall veteran whose life was changed just by going for a drink at the Stonewall Inn the night of the rebellion. He wasn't a particularly political activist back then. He was just literally going out with some friends. He was upset that Judy Garland had died, and we can talk about that later. And Bob is the first openly gay Democratic Party chairperson for Cape Cod and the islands. There's Lonnie Kahamano, and you'll hear a little bit more from her later. There's Mandy Carter. Oh, by the way, Lonnie lives in California. Mandy lives in Durham, North Carolina. There's Hardy Haberman. He's a born and raised native of Dallas, Texas. There's Amani Woody Macko, born and raised in Washington, D.C. And there's Edie Daly on the left and Jackie Merkin on the right. They live in my town, Northampton, Mass, and part of the year they live in Gulfport, Florida, for the colder months. And then there's one more person, and that's Joey Wasserman. Now, he may not look old to you. You're right, he's not. He's a young guy. He's not an elder. He's a Chinese-American Jewish gay man who works at SAGE, who works with elders. And he speaks passionately about bringing LGBTQ history to his own generation. And I included him for that very reason, because I wanted younger people to have someone else that they could relate to, as well as all of us, well, not about all of you, but all of me and these folks who are older. And so I'll give you a bit of a closer look at the people here. And you might hear stories that resonate with your own. And you might learn about how different each of these experiences from your own. But there may be some common themes that you might hear in these excerpts. And one of them is pain and sadness. And it's not always loving, even within the community. But as I found in my sexuality research, there's a fierce passion and resilience in this group. And so what about you? My question remains, where are you in this conversation? Could you find a way to become an ally with a Stonewall elder here in your congregation? Or could you find a way to become more included as a Stonewall elder in your congregation? Some of the themes you'll hear about tonight are bias, both internally and externally, invisibility, intimidation, especially by the police, which is a common theme today that we're dealing with all over the country, the importance of allies, racism, sexism, and of course, I wouldn't be a sexuality educator if I didn't include pleasure. So let's begin, and I'm going to ask Suzanne to get your mic unmuted. And I'm going to introduce you to, Lonnie Kahamano. Lonnie's she's a bisexual rights activist. She's a writer, she's a performer, a sex educator, and she's the co-author of a pretty famous book called Bi, B-I, Any Other Name. And she's got a great laugh, but she's also suffered great distress inside the LGBTQ community. She came out as bisexual after many years of activism in the lesbian community. And there she is in the middle today. Up on the left, she's in San Francisco as with her biphobia shield with bi and large. And there's somebody with biceps. She's walking in the bipole contingent in the 1984 International Gay and Lesbian Freedom Day Parade. Mm. And then on the right, you see this great poster of latex warriors when she was doing safer sex workshops in the bars in the 90s. And on the bottom, she's making a condom sexy. So you can see she's full of amazing fun. But she also recounts in her interview with me the utter invisibility of bisexual people and the hostility that she suffered from her lesbian friends when she came out as bi. So Suzanne, could you help us by reading Lonnie's quote here?
I will. It's a little tough for me to read the tiny print, but I'll do my best.
You can make it bigger, actually.
Can you? Can you?
Yeah.
Really? That would be lovely.
You could ask Mary Ellen how to do that.
I don't know. Mary Ellen, can you make the script bigger? It's really tiny.
I think it's from your end, Suzanne. I think if you make
I'm at 200% and it's still really, but that's okay. I'll do my best.
Okay.
I'll do my best. Okay. Even though it has been scary coming out as a lesbian, it felt right. For my whole life, I'd had crushes on girls and women, Coming out lesbian made sense, and it was a good fit. Coming out as bisexual was much more difficult. I didn't fit in anymore. Bisexuality made no sense. There was no visible community, no coming out books, nothing to support my experience. I'd been a biphobic lesbian, so I knew what was coming my way. Bisexuals were traitors and needed to choose a side. Everything I'd ever heard about bisexuals was up in my face. I'd never heard anything positive.
Thank you. Big snaps for you, Suzanne, and thanks for being able to read that tiny print.
You're welcome.
Next person I want to introduce you to is Mandy Carter. Mandy, as I said, is from Durham, North Carolina. She's an African-American lesbian. She was nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize in 2005, and she's a lifelong organizer and activist. She grew up in foster care with a Black family in upstate New York and came out in the 1960s and moved to New York City as soon as she could. Up on the left-hand corner, you can see Mandy as a cheerleader in high school. She worked with the War Resisters League. You might know the name of this guy up on top. That's Bayard Rustin. He was one of the architects of Martin Luther King's March on Washington. He was also a gay man who couldn't come out because of the prejudice that he was facing in those days. And she's, in the bottom right, she's goofing around a bit with Joanne Sheehan from the War Resisters League. Mandy speaks about the power of just one individual who changed her life. So Molly, could you unmute yourself and help us read Mandy's quote?
Jack Hickey, my social studies teacher, brought in this young white staffer from a group that I had never heard of before, the American Friends Service Committee. That one 40-minute class changed my life. This is 1966. While AFSC was a predominantly white peace group, they wanted to be an ally in and for the civil rights movement. He gave me the history of the Quakers, and then he talked about the power of one. He said, each and every one of us has a moral compass, and because of that, each and every one of us has the potential to impact change. They had an AFSC high school work camp up in the Pocono Mountains, and I went. It was the very first time I heard the name Bayard Rustin, and it was the first time I had heard the word gay by Mandy Carter.
Thank you. Big snaps. Thank you so much. Great. Now I want to introduce you to Hardy Haberman. As I said, he's a lifelong resident of Dallas, Texas. He's a gay male activist. He's an educator. He's a writer. He's a filmmaker, and he's an award-winning leader. He's active in the leather community. In fact, the photo on the top left is the cast and crew of his film, Leather, in 1996. That's Hardy, the second from the right on the top row, the guy with the glasses and well, I guess there's a lot of mustaches, but anyway, the guy with the glasses. There he is on the bottom right-hand corner as part of the Dallas contingent at the March on Washington in 1979, which I was at. If any of you were there, let me know. Hardy's on the right-hand side. And he talks about his early days as an activist and the marginalization of people in the bars in the 1970s. So I'm going to ask Marie to, unmute yourself, you did that. And if you could read Hardy's quote, that'd be fantastic.
My activism came from watching the civil rights movement in the 1960s, seeing the injustice there. When I first came out into the gay community, it was just post Stonewall, and the first gay bar I used to go to was the Bayou Club, a dance club. But they had a light that came on if the police were coming in, so that if you were dancing with a guy, you had to find a woman. And if you were a woman dancing with a woman, you had to find a guy. They would get raided all the time. The lights would flash, flash, flash. And if you weren't wearing at least 3 articles of male clothing or gendered clothing, you could be arrested for cross-dressing. And they would regularly come through and bust people.
Great, thank you. Big snaps. Thank you, Marie. The next person I want to introduce you to is Amani. Dr. Amani Macko describes the racism and sexism, both visible and invisible, that she fights every day as a lifelong resident of Washington, D.C. She's an African-American lesbian who has dedicated her life to creating an intentional community for LGBT and what she calls same gender loving, or SGL, elders. She's receiving an award from Michael Adams, who's the executive director of SAGE on the top right. And I just liked her manicure. So there's a photo of her hands on the bottom right. And when Louis and I were in Washington interviewing her, I just said, oh, please, one shot of her hands. But one of the things that Amani talks about is the struggle today, 50 years after Stonewall. So you know how we always say, you know, we've come a long way and things are a lot better. They are better, and yet we still have struggles. So I'm going to ask Margaret, oh, you're all set, to please read this for us. Thanks.
I get tired of peaceful protests because nothing really happens. Stonewall wasn't peaceful, and it was a linchpin that changed our world. The Tea Party wasn't peaceful. The linchpin that changed this from being a colony. People don't give up power. Homophobia is not much of a problem today. It's DC. But racism, sexism, that is so alive and well. And that's the fight, invisible and visible, that I fight every day.
Thank you. Thank you. Big snaps for you, Margaret. I really appreciate that. And we have one more person I want to introduce you to. Well, 2 more people I want to introduce you to. That's Edie and Jackie. They're a couple. They're residents, as I said, of Gulfport, Florida, and Northampton, Mass. Edie's a writer. She's on the left. She's a lesbian activist. She's a former bookstore owner. And Jackie is a retired social worker and professor. She was a professor at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Up on the top left, that's Jackie at a social work summer school in 1963. And there's Edie on the bottom right. Now, Suzanne, you got to really squint for this one because it's a great one. I don't want you to miss it. She's with 2 other shirtless lesbians at the New York City Dyke March in 1994. Edie calls that picture, "Keep your shirt on, lady," which is what someone yelled to her from the corner. Now, when I interviewed Edie and Jackie, Edie told me that she and Jackie met when they were in their 60s. Jackie is 90 now, and Edie's 82. They found love and desire, and it continues to the present day. So I'm going to ask Colleen if you could read this beautiful quote, and this is our last quote of the evening.
We'd both been through menopause, and then suddenly here we are being sexually active with our hormones trying to rage again. And so there we were, 60 and 66. I find that sex that I have with Jackie is the most satisfying of my whole life, and that is after 60. I find that it is more about relaxation, where I can finally be myself, where I can bring my whole self to the sexual experience. Edie Daly.
Beautiful. Thanks, Colleen. Great. So maybe you have some questions, maybe you have some thoughts, maybe you have some answers to the questions I was asking before. Feel free to jot them down in the chat box so we can offer some more insights to each other later, because you've invited me to speak tonight, but I think everybody on this call has something that they could offer as insights and ideas. These are just some of the resources that you could use, and I'd be happy to send these to Mary Ellen and Colleen if you're interested. And they're all clickable. You can just go right here and find these. This is This is an article that I wrote with the two women who were on my dissertation committee. They became my co-authors on the journal article from the dissertation. And you know, when you write a dissertation, I didn't realize this, it's not useful for any of the professors. You have to wait till you get published in a peer-reviewed journal. So the Journal of Homosexuality is actually a great journal, and I was really excited that I was able to get this article. And so that's the third one down. This one is my book, and this is something that I wrote for SAGE, for the LGBT Aging Center. And it's got a lot of really good resources within that. Tim Johnson's a very cool guy, and he just wrote this great book for clinical and administrative leaders in senior living communities. And then finally, this last one is a really nice fact sheet that SAGE put together. So I put these here. Some are scholarly, some are more popularly written, but I just wanted you to know that there's many other resources that you could get as well. And then just here, the photo credits. And then one last thought I wanted to give you before we go into more of a discussion mode so that you can really start talking and I can stop talking, because as much as I love to talk, it's a lot more fun when everybody else gets a chance. The LGBTQ elders in your congregation may have never spoken to anyone about their sexual orientation or their gender identity in a religious setting before. Your act of inclusion could be the beginning of a rich and fulfilling chapter for them and for the entire congregation. And I want to give you just one very personal moment from my life. I remember when my lover and I've been a lesbian for a very long time, you know, since that picture you saw of me in the 70s. When my lover and I went to our synagogue to talk with our rabbi about the possibility of us getting married. And I never imagined that I could be sitting in my synagogue and be able to talk in a loving way about being a lesbian. I thought it would be that moment where I have to be defending myself or I'd be afraid of somebody spewing something awful. And I started to cry, and I realized that I had never imagined that that could be my place, that I could never feel comfortable in my whole self there. And so I offer that to you because there may be people in your own congregation who are feeling that same way. So there's a bit of information here about how you could reach me, and please send me an email. I love getting emails from people. If you're interested in being on my mailing list, I send out an email twice a month with information about my podcast and about readings that I'm doing. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, we've set up a Facebook page. And I asked Colleen and Marilyn if one of them could just post that link into the chat box so that you can have it. And again, if you're interested in asking questions tonight that you don't feel comfortable asking in front of other people, just send me an email. That's the best, because then we'll have a conversation, or we could set up a phone call, just you and me privately, and be totally confidential.